It's wonderful to see so many people, here, but I'm not surprised given what an exciting lineup we've got for you. I'm going to hand over at this point, though, to Kitty, who has organised this event. I don't want to take any credit for all of her hard work. So, Kitty, if you'd like to introduce the event properly and our speakers.
Hello, thank you very much, Nick. So I'm so delighted to welcome our speakers today. As way of an introduction, I was sort of investigating or researching around the issue of sort of social media analytics and sort of the use of strategic narratives in authoritarian propaganda. And I came across the fantastic work of Dr. Patrick Chester, who is our first speaker today, particularly the extraordinary wisdom with a colleague, Dr. Audrey Wong. I reached out to Patrick because I thought the methodology that he's developed is so innovative that it really should be shared with as wide an audience as possible. So I am delighted that he's joining us today, all the way live from New Jersey. Our other speaker, I have had the pleasure of working with quite closely before, and that's Dr. Justin Lane, currently in Bratislava in Slovakia. Justin is one of the leaders, I would say, in the sort of the fusion between psychology and AI. His work in academia certainly speaks to this, but more recently, he can also offer insights from the tech industry forum as well, which is why I'm delighted to have him as our second speaker. So without further ado, it's only a short webinar. I don't want to eat into their time. So Patrick, over to you.
Okay. All right. And maybe I'll share screen. Okay. Oh, yeah, sorry, it's asking me permission to share screen.
You should have permission now. Please, yeah.
Or Kitty, could we share the slides? Could we share Patrick's slides?
We could do, yeah, if it's becoming difficult. I have it with me right here. Patrick, can you see that?
All right, apologize for that. All right, let me share a screen now. So it was an issue of Mac OS permissions, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. I'll stop sharing my screen then.
Okay. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for your patience. All right. Hello, everybody. So, yeah, my name, as said before, my name is Patrick Chester. I'm a new assistant professor over at Stevens Institute of Technology, and today I'm presenting a paper that I co-wrote with Professor Audrey Wong over at USC. You know, she is the one who originally suggested the idea of studying wedge narratives with diaspora in the United States. Yeah, I was kind of the author of the methodology. So together, between her substantive expertise and my methodological expertise, I think we produced a good paper that was recently published at Conflict Studies. So without further ado, let's get started. So in recent years, there has been a lot of speculation and some qualitative analysis indicating that there are foreign influence operations originating from China targeting Chinese Americans, you know, in North America, both the United States and Canada. And we thought that this was a topic that had been certainly examined in the news media, but not examined in a very rigorous way using quantitative methods. So this phenomenon falls under the umbrella of several other areas of research that have been growing dramatically in recent years. So it's been well documented that autocratic actors like Russia and China have used propaganda, censorship, and information to control to influence political attitudes of their domestic audience, and in some cases, foreigners and diaspora. This is particularly well documented in the case of Russia, targeting influence campaigns in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. There has also been a significant literature produced on the China's domestic propaganda and censorship apparatus, but much less on its efforts to manipulate opinion overseas. So the core questions that this project hopes to address are: first, does China's government make an effort to use propaganda to influence the beliefs of Chinese diaspora? Second, are these influence campaigns observable on China-based social media platforms? And third, what propaganda strategies do they employ to shape diaspora's beliefs and behaviors? So, a question that I'm sure many of you may have is, why would China's government care about diaspora at all? Right? We argue that diaspora can shape the homeland through economic capital and political activism. Right? So there's a historical case of the activist and revolutionary based in China, Sun Yat-sen, successfully overthrowing the Qing dynasty while living in the United States. He organized a revolution while living abroad. Additionally, diaspora can serve as agents of foreign policy. They can lobby groups and voters in their host societies. They can build economic and cultural bridges. And in some cases, they can protest and spark territorial and ethnic conflict. So there have been some examples of nationalist protests by Chinese university students in Taiwan over Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang issues. And there have been concerns about CCP-linked politicians elected in Australia and Canada. So let's turn to the platform of WeChat, right? So the question is, like, if we have these influence campaigns, where are they occurring? So one avenue through which this government may be operating its influence campaign is via the manipulation and presentation of content on WeChat. So WeChat, for those of you who don't know, WeChat is an overwhelmingly dominant source of information and mode of communication for Chinese citizens, with 1.2 billion active users. The closest analogous platform that used by most of you probably would be WhatsApp. Although this WeChat has subscription accounts and services that people follow for news and information, which makes it a bit distinct. So diaspora use WeChat to keep in touch with family and friends back at home and network with diaspora abroad. They also use it, can apply to subscription accounts, which provide chronological news feeds curated by account moderators. Which is exactly what we are targeting with our data collection efforts and our analysis. So the theories that we hope to test lie in the idea that the Chinese propaganda campaign is attempting to drive a wedge between these diaspora and their host societies, right? And they do so using what we call wedge narratives, which are designed to keep diaspora loyal to to China and discourage them from adopting liberal ideologies from their host society. And we define a wedge narrative as a rhetorical strategy designed to increase divisions between diaspora and their host countries. A successful wedge narrative may increase the influence of the home society that they have over diaspora. So, looking at a few different wedge narratives that we expect to see a focus on racial discrimination and violence, right? So the idea is that they will highlight anti-Asian racial discrimination and violence with the objective of increasing division between Chinese Americans and their host society. And we expected this to be effective because it is especially salient in the US context. And the data that we look at covers a period of the early COVID years, right? 2019 to 2021. And certainly during that period, there were a lot of anti-Asian protests or discrimination events that could be utilized to this effect. The second narrative that we examine is a political wedge, and the strategy here we expect to be an effort to undermine perceptions of democracy, right? So by highlighting cases of political unrest and corruption in liberal democratic regimes, the Chinese government may keep diaspora aligned with their own political system, right? So the idea is to create a narrative portraying democracy as corrupt and chaotic. So how did we gather this data with which we can test our theories? Well, there has been little empirical analysis performed on WeChat in the past, with a couple notable exceptions. The reason for this is that the API is extremely complex and highly constrained, and this makes it very difficult to collect WeChat data. There are some exceptions. Lu and Penn were able to get headlines of articles through Sugo Weixin, but we wanted the full text of WeChat articles, which proved to be a bit more of a challenging undertaking. So our solution to this problem was to use a new Python package that facilitates access to the API called WeChat Articles. And using that package, we scraped over 64,000 articles from 14 subscription accounts, covering the period of 2019 to 2021. Now, the second challenge, once we had that data, was to develop a measure of framing, right? The association between some object and some attribute, right? To do this, we used a method called word embeddings, which are a machine learning tool that allows us to measure how similar words and concepts are based off their co-occurrence in text, right? They have been applied in similar contexts to measure propaganda and censorship in text data. And I have another paper in which I apply them to measure domestically targeted propaganda in China. And Garg et al. And Kaskin et al. Have similar ideas that we learned from. So using this methodology, we quantify how similar two sets of objects and attributes are in the text produced by government and independent subscription accounts, right? Using the government as kind of the treated group and the independent subscription accounts as kind of our control group. So in particular, we're looking at how Asian, right? So kind of like words representing like Asian American are associated with racism and violence in the text. For countries, for the political propaganda, we expect to see an association between countries such as the United States and, Germany, democratic countries, and concepts such as chaos and corruption, right? So we use democratic countries as a proxy for framing, liberal democracy as chaotic and corrupt. So here are our findings. So here we have the average association between racism, violence, and Asian Americans across different subgroups and different subscription accounts. So on this, sorry, is there a question? Okay, sorry. So here we see the different subscription accounts. The first top half are those affiliated with the government. The bottom half, we have those that are independent, that are not affiliated with the government, right? And the x-axis, we have the degree of similarity between these racism terms and the Asian American object, right, across these different accounts. This dotted line represents the group average for government accounts and independent accounts. And as you can see, there's a higher degree of similarity for the government accounts, for the racism, attribute with the Asian American object across, across these different subscription accounts. Its effect is particularly strong for the Here's America and U.S. China Press accounts. Right, we see a similar positive effect for the association between violence and Asian American, although it is notably smaller. And the independent accounts are more heterogeneous in terms of their behavior. So looking at the association between regime type and these attributes, right? So we look at chaos and corruption and how they're associated with countries across various levels of democratic scale. So we use VDEM as our measure of, how democratic a country is. And our expectation would be that more democratic countries are more associated with chaos and corruption compared to the baseline, our control group. and authoritarian countries. And we can see there's a significant divergence, right? So as we move across the regime scale from authoritarian to democratic, we see a increase in the gap between our treated group and our control group, right? So the bottom line representing our control group, the independent publications, right? We see a higher association between chaos and these democratic countries for the government media compared to the control media. Likewise, for corruption, we see this kind of disjoint for highly liberal democratic countries that are portrayed as more corrupt than the independent subscription accounts would suggest. For sports, well, we see a difference in kind of the absolute level of similarity. We don't see a difference in the relative level of similarity. So this is our placebo attribute, and we see no significant change across regime types once we take into account this kind of baseline level of difference. So this placebo test indicates that this is not just some systemic artifact of our measurement strategy. There is a difference in how chaos and corruption relate to regime type for our treated group compared to our benchmarks. So to summarize our conclusions, right, government accounts portray Asian diaspora as targets of violence and racism at higher levels than do non-government accounts. They also portray democratic countries as chaotic and corrupt. So what our study accomplishes is, first of all, identifying a newly scraped archive of WeChat articles, which are quite difficult to gather. It also provides the first quantitative evidence that Chinese government uses anti-Asian and anti-democracy frames to drive a wedge between diaspora communities and their host societies. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to your comments and questions. And I apologize if I went over a little bit.
If anyone has any question, please can you raise your virtual hand up and I will unmute you. Or you can put it in the chat, whichever you prefer.
If people want to think of questions for Patrick, and we can sort of address them at the end, perhaps we should move on to the next speaker.
I think Justin, apologies for interrupting. I think Justin had a question.
Happy to. I was actually going to ask. Yeah, thank you for that. It was quite interesting to see, how you approached that. In terms of potential intervention strategies, it seems that they're doing, quite well. But how could it potentially be, dealt with at a more at a higher level, right? So what's the sort of real world consequences, and what could be done to actually try and reverse the foreign malign influence there?
Yeah, so it's a challenging question, right? Because WeChat is a app that's developed in China and based in China, right? It's available in the App Store, right? Google App Store in the United States. I think that some requirement that applications be transparent in terms of the recommendation algorithms could help address some, maybe targeted propaganda. But since these are subscription accounts, the idea is that this is probably opted in. So the users are probably opting into this information to some degree. It might be difficult to prevent that if you're a policymaker, right? But if these accounts are being preferentially recommended to individuals, that might be something that could be addressed through legislation by, let's say, requiring that there be some transparency in terms of what recommendation algorithms social media companies use. But yeah, it's a tough policy problem. I mean, I guess the brute force approach would be to ban Chinese social media apps, like what's happening with TikTok, right? I'm not a particular fan of that approach because I think it's kind of a cudgel, and it doesn't address the possibility that there may be some non-China based platforms that engage in, politically motivated recommendation strategies and content strategies which could also be harmful in similar ways, right? So I think this is likely a bigger problem than just WeChat, although WeChat is
Yeah.
obviously a good example.
Yeah, it seems some of the information that's come out shows that that very much was the case with a lot of the political rhetoric in U.S. social media channels, as there was fingers on the scales of those systems.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Although it's more difficult to actually get American social media data as well, thanks to highly expensive API costs that have been imposed by American social media companies. So there's actually been a decrease in research looking at foreign influence campaigns as a direct consequence of making like the Twitter API and the Reddit API and so on and so forth highly costly to use.
Mm-hmm.
Kitty?
Thank you, Kitty. Patrick, I wondered, so as a social psychologist, sort of interested in different cultural contexts, particularly China, it's unbelievably difficult in some circumstances to sort of attempt to get data from China. Could you perhaps talk a little bit about the combined expertise that you and Audrey have to make this kind of endeavor possible? Like, what are the combinations of skills needed to be able to produce a report of this caliber?
So I will say that the collection of data from WeChat was by far like so first off, I have quite a bit of expertise in using Python and R. I have a lot of experience scraping data from a wide variety of websites and social media platforms. And collecting data from WeChat is far and away the most challenging data collection task I've ever undertaken, to the extent that it might not be possible to gather data like this anymore. The reason for that is that since we began our project, WeChat, in fact, implemented some additional restrictions on the use of their accounts, right? And in particular, they require that new WeChat accounts that have full access to its platform need to uh, uh, be associated with Chinese phone numbers and a Chinese SIM card. So to create a WeChat account that you need to gather data that like we did, you need to be able to get a Chinese-based SIM card and activate it. And these days, given the lower amount of travel between the U.S. and China, this is actually quite a challenging undertaking. In terms of like how the details of how we collected this data, we essentially simulated a WeChat desktop application and intercepted its communications with their servers. Uh, and by intercepting those communications, we were able to kind of trick it into communicating the full, text data from subscription accounts, which we could then gather ourselves. Right. Of course, because we're effectively tricking their application using their servers using a desktop application, they sometimes blocked us for suspicious behavior. Right. So behaving in a regular way. So we included some randomness in terms of how our scraper behaved to try to avoid these blockers. So it became kind of a cat and mouse game involving kind of us innovating to make our scraper more behaviorally human and them trying to identify our regularities in our behavior. So, I mean, I could talk more about it. There's certainly a lot to say about the data collection process for this project, but suffice to say, this is not this is a pretty challenging undertaking to get data from WeChat.
Thanks, Patrick. Final two questions, one from Nick and one from our chat, Rachel. Nick, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Patrick. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I've sort of got two questions. The big one, the main one, I suppose, is whether there are any measures of effectiveness. So the aim is to drive a wedge. I mean, obviously you've got no measures of offline effects, but I just wondered whether through things like trends, reposts, anything along those lines, whether you were able to measure effectiveness at all, or whether you think it's conceivable that effectiveness might be measured, albeit in a way that perhaps you haven't been able to do.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's a question that both Audrey and I have, and we are hoping to explore in a future project, because yeah, I think it's difficult to say how effective this propaganda is just through looking at subscription account data through in an observational setting, right? Because we cannot see downstream how users are integrating this information into their day-to-day lives and how they're integrating into their beliefs, and so on and so forth. So what we're hoping to do down the line is to run an experiment where we expose individuals to these, prototypical versions of these types of propaganda, and examine how that impacts kind of their feelings of attachment to their host society and their feelings towards liberal democracy.
Okay, well, that's great. Thanks. If I can just slip in a quick one. Do you have any measure of the subtlety of this messaging? I mean, would it be obvious, do you think, to a recipient that they were trying to be influenced, that this was coming from the state, or might it just look like part of the sort of, yeah, how subtle was it, do you think?
I would say there was a full range, right? So we did some qualitative analysis. Audrey in particular helped with that. And there were definitely instances of the propaganda being pretty overt, right? Where it looks like there is a pretty clear attempt to portray, let's say, democracy as being chaotic, or democratic country as being chaotic. There are some articles that had some very explicit language talking about the violence targeted towards Asian Americans. But there were also those that were more subtle, right? I would say that, if they're looking at articles produced by, let's say, Global Times versus Xinhua, right? Xinhua tends to be very subtle in its delivery of propaganda, right? It attempts to portray itself as something like, Reuters or the AP, where it presents the information in a fairly objective tone, but it'll also include associations, right? It'll very selectively target topics for its news coverage that are consistent with the intended narrative, right? On the other end of the spectrum, you have articles republished from the Global Times, which is fairly explicit in kind of its anti-Western, anti-democratic framing of issues, right? So you see both extremes represented, which is why we wanted to use kind of an aggregate impact, right? Using word embeddings is nice because it lets us to see kind of overall, if we look across all the articles published in a given publication in a given period, what is the kind of the average association, right?
Yeah.
The average impression you get. And I think that's useful because that tells us something about how people might perceive these objects if this is the main news they consume.
Yeah, it's really impressive research and fascinating. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Patrick. Final quick question, a very quick one from Rachel Ward. What do you think about American TikTok users moving over to other Chinese social media apps around the time TikTok became briefly unavailable in the US a few months ago?
Oh, so reading was it Red Note, right? Xiaohongshu. Yeah, so I think that it's interesting because you do seem to have a self-selection of kind of some American young people to platforms that are influenced by Chinese laws and regulations, and maybe subject to their propaganda efforts. I think that this is potentially problematic, right? I think that a lot of young people may be naive as to the messaging, strategies that may be targeted towards them, and what content is kind of selectively removed on these platforms. My understanding, though, is that Red Note's popularity has gone down somewhat since TikTok's tenure has been extended. Of course, TikTok itself is potentially problematic as it is owned by ByteDance, which is based in China, and there are ongoing research efforts, some of which I'm involved with, looking at TikTok content to see if there are systematic biases in terms of what videos are shown by its recommendation algorithms and which topics are omitted. Right. So just to give a kind of qualitative example, right, if you look for videos relating to the Tiananmen Square incident on TikTok, you will not see anything related to the protests on your top, search results. In fact, you will probably see some very nice videos about how pretty the Tiananmen Square is during the morning, right? To see them raising the flag and stuff like that. So, and that's very different from the search results you'll get on other social media platforms, right? So I think the popularity of TikTok is potentially concerning, given the influence the Chinese government has over it. But again, similar to the issue I discussed before, I think the solution is not necessarily to ban it, because there are a lot of concerns, potential concerns with the recommendation algorithms of American social media companies, such as Twitter and others of that nature. So I think the solution is actually algorithmic transparency. But that's my personal opinion as a person working in this area, to be taken with a grain of salt.
Thanks, Patrick. So now we're going to move on to Justin's talk.
Very good. Okay. I believe I can, let me see if we can just get through the share screen here. Very good. You guys can see the share screen? I'm never quite sure with Teams. Very good. Thank you. Yes, so as Kitty mentioned at the very beginning, she and I have had the pleasure of working together for some time in the past, having met each other as far back as graduate school. I'll not tell anybody how long ago that really was. Since then, I've gone very much into the AI space, focusing a lot on conflict analytics, conflict prediction, analyzing social media in high-risk environments in particular. And happy to tell you guys a bit about the Russian context as an interesting sort of two sides of the same coin. A lot of the issues that we're seeing with the what's going on in the Chinese context. To kind of start it off a bit about the sort of work that I do in the area of conflict prediction. I have been in the AI space for quite some time and really focusing on the use of artificial intelligence as ways to try and gain insight into social groups and different cultures and problems throughout the world. We do work for the United Nations, working with different governments, working with different businesses as well that are kind of spread around the world. And focus a lot really on humanitarian and security issues. So we've done work in refugee resettlement, trying to help figure out what can be done in terms of where to best place people. Done a lot of work in the misinformation space, profiling for counter extremism in paramilitary situations. The team is myself. We have people around the world these days, primarily in Europe and the United States. But myself, Professor Laron Schultz, who we started this collaboration effort some 10 years ago to really try and set up something that was scalable. So it wasn't necessarily just a single research project, but rather a set of tools that we could apply across the world and across all different kinds of social media platforms as much as we could get. In terms of the data and in terms of the sort of places that we could cover, media as well as social media. I mentioned some of the places we worked with in the past, such as the United Nations. We worked in Palestine, Bosnia, in Slovakia, Norway, where we were doing a lot of work on misinformation during the COVID lockdowns and trying to understand, where are these threats coming? What catches on in different places? But as we go forward, I want to kind of look, specifically at Telegram and VK or Kontakte, which is the Russian version of Facebook. Telegram is a bit more global. It was originally started in Russia. It was actually both companies are founded by the same person, Pavel Durov, who was recently arrested in France because they weren't able to see who was saying what on Telegram. Both of these platforms are actually very, very interesting. The Contact is a very controlled platform, whereas Telegram is a bit more of the Wild West. It's a much more decentralized approach. It's known because they say it's one of these sort of dark web messaging apps like Signal, and you can't get to the data. That's actually very untrue, both in the strong version of that claim and the weak version of that claim. In the weaker version, you just can't get any of the data. They have an API that's one of the best APIs in social media. Actually, you can get data very easily from Telegram, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that can be done. And in terms of you can't get data that was done end-to-end encryption, that's also not true. It's just far more difficult to do, and you need to be very determined in order to do it. Vkontakte is not as peer-to-peer. It's sort of like one-to-many. It's basically set up like Facebook, and I'll get into a little bit more. What I'm going to focus more on is I'm going to discuss a little bit about the sort of analyses that can be done, the sort of conclusions that could potentially be drawn. But I want to focus a little bit more actually on like the technical issues of like how do you actually get this data? What are the options that are available? What might be best for the different use cases for the people that we have on the call today, and kind of set it off so that you can go off and do your own kind of interesting research there. To set a little bit more of the context, the reason why these are particularly interesting and also very interesting in the sort of modern context is similar to how China is very walled off from the rest of the world. Russia is also the same. There is no pretending that there is free speech there, or sort of like free technology to even do that. The social media bans in Russia have made it extremely unique and a very interesting place to look at. The bans have also led to a lot of different copycat sites. So Vkontakte is not really a copycat of Facebook in the same way that RuTube is a copycat of YouTube. Not quite even trying there. But it is something that has led to this kind of siloing off of the social media environment in Russia. Telegram is more global. It does have 70 million daily users in Russia. As a estimate is around 2024 on that. Vkontakte is a little bit larger, but not so much. And as I mentioned, Telegram is kind of broadcast style, whereas Vkontakte is much more of a typical network. Telegram, of course, runs channels that are the bit of the bread and butter, but you can do one-to-one messaging there as well. Whereas, Vkontakte is something a little bit more akin to what we might be used to. In terms of like prior research, there's a lot of research that other people have done as well, and I've got references at the end that people can look at, where they've looked at propaganda, they've looked at hacktivism, mobilization, mental health issues, and there are data sets that are also freely available that can be analyzed that have been made available for researchers in the past from Telegram, that you can even look at. Some of them are also looking at a statistical analysis as well, that I kind of throw in there that is particularly fascinating, looking at what kind of structures do you actually see on Telegram? How are those different from other social media sites? In terms of what you can learn, and I'll dig into a little bit on Telegram here for a second because I look at that a lot. What I'll show you here, this is stuff that comes out of our platform live. It's from a Eastern European social media and kind of propaganda site that's been used in Eastern Europe, particularly to try and spread different narratives and reduce resiliency on sort of the eastern flank of NATO. We are regularly tracking a lot of different Telegrams channels and using things like topic analysis, using a similar approach that's based more in word vectors, as Patrick was discussing briefly there, and looking at word embedding spaces and trying to figure out what kind of topics are being spoken about, how similar are those topics, and creating an automated system so that we don't need to spend days, weeks, potentially even months trying to understand what those topics are, but actually using AI systems to train the systems to find out what the best fit matches actually are, so that you, when you click on a Telegram channel, instead of taking several weeks to get something that still holds itself to the scientific standard of a publishable paper, we're usually able to kind of turn around a Telegram channel in less than 12 hours. And then from there, it's live monitoring after that, right? So you can see the rise and fall of different narratives, such as here, being critical of different political systems and governments, conspiracy theories and misinformation that are coming out. The sort of the tensions between Russia and Slovakia, for example, is something that's coming up a lot, and these end up being stoked in order to try and really push that wedge issue of Russia and the Ukraine war, for example, in the context of Slovakia. But this is a very high level narrative analysis. You can also go a lot further, and I've grayed out names here because we do have the names and handles of the users, that where we have the entirety of the network of Telegram, right? You can see who's interacting with whom and what are those reactions. Are they more positive? Are they more negative? Are they more critical? What kind of content do those reactions have? And effectively that creates a network within a network on a Telegram channel, right? So you can interpolate the interactions between individuals to see who's replying to whom on each one of these networks, or in each one of these channels, and use that to create a social network that you can extract algorithmically, and then see, are those interactions typically negative or positive, and rank and look at who the most influential users are, right? And some of these channels have tens of thousands of users, and a lot of the usage is very mundane. But some of them are definitely power users. A lot of them, we can even get further into understanding what they look like, and what are most important in terms of the factors for individual people. Here I'll show you an analysis that we do, where we also can look at the consensus. When we're now analyzing data from Telegram, or any other social media channel, we're actually looking to create psychological digital twins of those individuals, so that we can actually really understand what is it that makes them tick, what is central to their identities, and we can probe those algorithmically, but not only understand it at that individual level, but because we have the data from an entire group, you can also look to see how many people are discussing topics in a way that is similar. So what are those high consensus topics? And this, what are the ones that are most important? What are the ones that also, if you think about it, are these transitional topics that they're using to connect their core beliefs to the everyday narratives that they see in the media? And we can map those out and understand that in real time, but also look at how they're related. For example, here, these are all color coded based on their relationship to issues around authority and morality, and trying to understand, for example, freedom is something that's red hot in terms of authority, but we can also look and see here certain beliefs that have higher levels of consensus along this. The bottom axis are consensus and importance, and the other one being betweenness, or how often it's a mediating concept between different groups. This allows us to map down to the individual belief level within a group, what's causing the group to tick, what is kind of going on in not just the minds of the individual, but sort of like the mind of the group as itself, but also understand how could you potentially create a narrative or understand a narrative that could potentially change the beliefs of that group, right? You don't want to go for the high consensus beliefs, because those are just, they're so totemic to the group itself that you're not really going to be able to get any movement there, right? So we have to be a little bit more careful about going after those concepts, but other concepts could be moved that can reframe those and potentially, look at that from a strategic communications or stratcom perspective, that can be extremely valuable. And so this is the kind of work that we do, when we're analyzing social media in the intelligence and security space, that you can do across them. As I mentioned, we build these up from the lowest level. So this is, for example, an individual profile of a user that's drawn from the same Telegram group, where we've analyzed them on over 90 different dimensions of their psychology, looking at morality, which are, of course, key behavioral drivers, particularly in the disinformation space, but also looking at social issues that they're interested in, things like who's in in their group and not in their group, or inclusivity and exclusivity, looking at issues of conflict, but also looking at like cultural tightness and looseness. That is to say, how tolerant are they on variations or violations of social norms within the group, and then looking at other issues like friendship or family or humanity. And we also can do Big Five personality, looking at issues of how much they're talking about different aspects of gender, or how much they're talking about different issues in a space of emotion, right? Are they angry about things? Are they sad about things? Do they have high levels of anxiety? And can do that and get very good readings. Even this particular individual, they've never posted in the channel, but they've commented 42 times, and that's enough for us to get a reliable signal on this particular individual, and can use that, and we iterate that for all of the thousands or tens of thousands, potentially even hundreds of thousands of people in these groups. And we've done them in groups all the way up to several million users in any particular group through this system. So it allows us to look at all the way from the individual level of who cares about what and what could that correlate with, all the way up to how much consensus is there around particular beliefs, and what does that mean. So that's kind of a background on why these platforms are particularly interesting, the kinds of data that we're able to get out of this, and then to dig a little bit more into some of the practicalities, put some meat on the bone for people that maybe want to be getting there on their own, right? Telegram does have a bot API, and that can obviously be used for malicious purposes. The bot can do whatever you want to tell the bot to do. But the bot also can be used as a listener inside of a channel. And this is a very common way of actually looking at this and interacting, right? The bot is listening for new interactions, it's listening for new things, but it also can respond, right? So this is also used by companies in customer service. Right? So it's not always just malicious intent here, but it is something that is often used for malicious intent. At the company, we had a client where we did discover a net of bots that were operating across Telegram and several other social media channels. It seemed to be a state-based bot that was trying to run foreign malign influence campaigns around the area of Israel-Palestine, for example. And it was effectively turning up that social heat and creating changing that environment and the rhetoric, and just basically being offensive. But it was being offensive on both sides. And what we had found was, interestingly enough, that somebody basically just turned it all the way up and let it go as quickly as possible, to the point that it was sending out multiple posts on Telegram and Twitter and these other channels basically every second. But it did it on Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. So when most of the world was either partying, drinking, or sleeping, this bot network was really working overtime to try and turn up the heat and try and create as much social tension as it possibly could have within those different communities. There's also a full API client, MT Proto. So if you're looking at that, you do want to watch out though for when you're using different libraries like Telethon, Pyrogram, some of the other libraries that come out of the box. Make sure that you're not just requesting all of the data all of the time. Throw in random pauses as well, because you could potentially be banned. And those could be different problems that you may have to deal with. Another way of doing it, of course, are data brokers. Telegram and VK data are potentially bought and sold, and there are pros and cons to this. Of course, it is expensive. It is the API and things like that with Telegram are free, effectively free. You are still going to have to pay a certain amount if you're doing it really at large scales for the cloud infrastructure to actually keep those systems running 24/7. So it's not just running off of a local laptop. You can also run it off a local laptop if you need to. The data brokers have their pros and their cons, as I mentioned. The pros, though, is that the setup on that is very quick, and it's also curated data. So that way you get to focus on the analysis, not setting up the pipeline that you need. And that's something that can definitely be there. There is also the gray zone, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is that you can get Telegram data from secret chats. Those chats do have end-to-end encryption, but when your device is unlocked, it's actually quite similar to like Signal and WhatsApp, sorry, Signal and WhatsApp and other platforms like this, where once you have the device and the device is unlocked, it's going to take the database that runs on that device and it decrypts that database and can give you local access to it as well. So it's a little bit tricky, but it definitely is possible. Obviously, it has been done. There are a lot of instances where Telegram and Signal, for example, there were chats from those groups that were submitted as evidence for people, for example, involved famously in the January 6th issues around the U.S. Capitol, and that was obtained through on-device access. VKontakte is fairly similar. They do have a REST API. That's going to be able to get you comments and things about groups. There's a streaming API as well, where you can have what's called a fire hose, where it's just going to be throwing all of the data on the platform to you. And then you also have what they call long pull API, which is near real-time events. These are all just different approaches where you algorithmically could use R, Python, Java, whatever language you really want. That's going to be sending back JSON formatted replies to you so that you can then gather that data and analyze it as you see fit. The other two that are there, one, data brokers, same pros and cons as before. You would be surprised as to what VKontakte is willing to sell about the population. A lot of people would think, oh, well, because they're in Russia and it's a more authoritarian space, or that they have more limitations and they don't want people analyzing their data. You would be surprised actually what they're selling to data brokers, and we're talking contracted data brokers that are not buying and selling like scraped dark web data. We're talking the data brokers that have contracts with VKontakte to sell that data to analysts and companies, right? So VK knows that they're selling that data. They've agreed to sell that data, and the data is still there nonetheless. There's also scraping. Bellingcat, which is another company sort of in a similar space of analyzing data, particularly in the area of foreign malign influence. They have an open source scraper for VK, and that is by far one of the top places that I think most of the people in this audience would want to start with. It becomes a very, very useful tool. It's gotten a lot of interest generally within the data analytics community for people who are interested in VK data. So as I mentioned, similar to Telegram, if you're scraping and you're scraping a lot, basically, and you're scraping from the same IP address, that is to say the same computer without using VPNs and changing VPNs or using something like a Tor network, it is probably going to what they call throttle you down, right? They're going to cut off your access either temporarily, potentially permanently, because they know that you're going and you're just trying to scrape that data. No human is clicking on a website 300 times, but a computer can hit a website 300 times without a problem, right? And so it's very clearly something that is like a scraper operating, and they're going to shut down your IP, and you're going to have to use a VPN or some other means of changing your IP before you could continue. So there's some pros and cons on that one. I would say the official API is going to be safer for researchers. It's going to offer structured data. It's going to have documentations. It's going to tell you what those rate limits are, and you could do that. There's also an aspect that I'll mention briefly, is that there's also an issue of, when it comes to scraping, of course, of ethical scraping, in terms of respect for the platform and its terms and its user privacy and things like that. But the point that I'll just raise here, and I kind of put it in the black and white there, is that the ethics of doing work in conflict and when you're dealing with foreign malign influence and you're taking a real practical look at what's actually happening in the social media environment between the West and China, or the West and Russia, is that ethics are not just an academic philosophy. It's not just an academic exercise. It's a very real world situation. And there are practical considerations in this space that need to be balanced with the threats and security concerns of what's happening when you have active attempts to destabilize entire countries using social media platforms. So there, as I say, right, there's a time for LinkedIn posts and there's a time for actual security conversations. So depending on what you're doing and where your place is, if you're working in a more government space, that's going to be different than someone who's going to have to go through an IRB as an undergraduate researcher. And I think that there's a time and place for that, and we should weigh all things in consideration of what the benefits are for what's going on. From a higher level there with general considerations, yeah, I mentioned the Bellingcat VK scraper. It is an open source Python tool. You can find it on GitHub. It's very easy to use. You can use it either as a CLI, which is command line interface if you're super nerdy, or you can use it as a library, right? You can import the library into Python the way that most normal people do it. That's the way I would prefer to do it personally. It's great if you're doing open source intelligence, right? If you're doing investigative work. It is still subject to the rate limits that I mentioned. The biggest issue, actually, at least personally, I don't think it's the rate limits. I think it's the structure, because the issue with all scraping, and it doesn't really matter where you are on it, it's just true of scraping generally, is the moment the website changes its structure, and it may not even be visibly apparent that something has changed, but when they change the structure of the website itself, that scraper could just potentially be a critical failure until you can fix that. And so it's just something to watch out for. I mean, it's still, I would say the Bellingcat VK scraper would be the go-to for researchers. That's the one to be there, particularly if API setup isn't necessarily feasible. The other aspects that I would take into consideration, particularly from a research perspective, is that naturally you have censorship shocks, right? So you're going to have regional blocking that could potentially happen. You're going to have issues of speed limitations. You're going to have the selection bias, right? So if you're looking at something like VK, the algorithm itself is going to be determining a lot of aspects of the interactions that you see. Right, and this is also true of Facebook. This is also true of Twitter or X. Right, is that if you're looking to see, oh, I want to see what's getting the most likes. What gets the most likes is what gets the most views. What gets the most views is determined by the algorithm that's promoting posts in people's feeds. Right, and those can be throttled up and down by the actual creators of the websites in order to ensure that certain content is seen and certain content is not seen. Right, and that's already being done. That's not something that's unique to VK or unique to anything really. Telegram is based on timing, right? So when you get into a Telegram channel, the default basically is you're going to be scrolling through and seeing things as they come in time, as opposed to it being curated for you and being shown to you because they think it's going to increase your time on site. That's not the same for Facebook, for example. So I would be mindful of using things like interaction account or interaction counts as a particular signature in research, unless you can defend that you can control for that in some way that's meaningful for your research question. The other aspects, of course, are the terms of service that I mentioned. There is going to be issues from the legal regulations, particularly around VK, where you're only going to reach, as I say, right, you can only reach what they want you to reach. There is one of the key issues. The other thing that I want to bring up has to do with sort of self-selection and the self-bias.
Justin.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just mindful that we're over time, and I know some people will probably have to go, and I know some people will have some questions to ask. So sorry, there's no polite way to interrupt somebody on.
No, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. Yeah, I'd lost track of the time.
I was just going to
wrap it up by saying that one of the other things to consider is that people are self-selecting when they're being watched as to what's being put on the platform. So the social media is not always the perfect research venue, but it often is better than anything else. So I leave you guys with some general pointers as to whether or not you're doing this, and I can circulate these slides amongst everybody here in terms of if you're doing research, if you're doing research on sensitive topics, if you're doing security work, where you should probably point in that. And then references across everything there for everything from GitHubs that I mentioned to different laws that I had cited or suggested. So, and my email's here as well for anybody who would like it. Feel free to reach out to me after this as well.
That was brilliant.
Sorry about that. Sorry, I didn't realize the time had gone by so quick.
No, not at all. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. We have one question in the comments already. Simon, do you want to say it out loud or?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Nick. Thanks very much for that, Jason. I thought it was really, really interesting. I thought it was a really novel way of looking at Telegram posters on that. What I was particularly interested in was I like that idea of kind of thinking about it of the mind of the group. And you talked about how you could account for people shaping that. I wondered about like how you accounted for people who were just posting frequently and probably had importance through that way versus people who didn't post as often but probably got more interactions. And then in keeping with the kind of point that Nick was raising, I think it's interesting about the kind of reactions. And we know with a lot of these Telegram groups that there's a lot of people who are just sort of self-confessed kind of lurkers, I guess you would call them, who don't really interact with much or don't post. I just wondered if you had any kind of novel ways of thinking about them. Did you collect data points in terms of, you know, the things that they liked, or were you collecting data on every single person within those channels? Because I think we often think about it just from one side and we don't think about it from the majority almost of those people who are in there. So I'd just be really interested to hear any of your thoughts on that. But I thought it was a fantastic presentation, so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, the post frequency aspect of social media analytics, I do find very fascinating, right? Because there's a well-documented power law distribution that a small percentage of the users on any social media channel are posting the majority of the content on that channel, right? So it's sometimes like 80-20, people even call it the 80-20 rule. It's actually usually closer to like a 90-10 rule. Like 90% of the content is going to be generated by 10% of the population. But every time that you create an interaction, even if it's a like or a clap or a heart, you're leaving your digital signature there. And so sometimes you can go through and just say, look, I just want to see if someone's motivated enough to post something. I just want to see that. But you also can go deeper and say, actually, let me see what the psychological signature is of the information that has engaged you enough to give it not just a reply, but also give it maybe a like or something along those lines. And that also is leaving a signature that could be picked up on. Typically, I'm not so interested in those because it's very easy to leave a like, right? Even a share is not that interesting, right? It's really a comment or a post where someone has given at least the bare minimum of their life's energy to suggest their intention or their psychology. Shares and likes are literally the least thing you can do as a human being on the world today. So I don't think it's very valuable data, but it does help you to create the basis of the network, because you can see who's interacting with what and the different people that they're interacting with. But yeah, frequency I don't think is super important. It's really the content of what they're posting, and you want to find the central agents, the central actors. Because the most frequent posters are often not the people who are going to be the most violent if you're looking at a conflict space. It's actually people who are more medial in the network. The leaders of the Telegram channel, they're typically influencers and leaders. What you want is the person who's going to be influenced to do something. I find that to be a far more valuable insight to be able to generate.
Thank you. Did anybody else I mean, I have a question, but I don't want to abuse my chair's position too much. Is anybody, Patrick?
Hi, fantastic presentation, Justin. It's really cool data that you're sharing with us. Yeah, I'd love to take a stab at using that API both with Telegram and VK at some point. So I guess I had a couple questions about like the different metrics that you shared with us. So you had a couple of dimensions there on some of your visualizations. You know, you have a consensus metric, you have an importance metric, and I think you mentioned in passing, but like, so are some of those network derived characteristics, right? So like, between centrality, eigenvector centrality, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
Because yeah, I was like that. The way you described them sounded a little familiar, but I was kind of hoping you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm a massive fan of informatics generally, and the graph theory work that's been done and how that interacts with the study of social media is just absolutely critical. So we do a lot of that work there, and so when we're looking at betweenness, we are looking specifically at like a graph network metric of betweenness. We also, for example, track the entirety of global media coverage of like which countries and publishers are discussing what other countries countries and publishers to look for those similar signatures. So we also on a 15-minute basis are updating a graph of the global media flows and information flows around the world across about 190 countries. And we're using, for example, that when you're looking for the most influential places, you actually don't want to just look at the ones that are the most central in a traditional sense, right? You really want to look at an eigenvector centrality there. So we've also incorporated that as well, so that you can understand where it's likely to flow in the future, because who has the most influential friends is often more important than whether or not you yourself are influential.
Right. Yeah. Very cool. And one quick follow-up, thanks for that answer. So you showed like how these different topics, you showed that you have kind of like a topic model and the content produced by users over time, which I thought was very, very interesting. And I guess my question was, like, on the one hand, I love kind of like live, like visualizations of what content is being produced on website. But having been involved in a project like this before, one of the challenges is that if you have a topic model, it very quickly becomes out of date as new topics emerge. So do you have a kind of updating schedule for your topic model, or how does that work exactly?
We have two ways of approaching it. On the one hand, when we're looking at the large narrative topics, yes, we can update those as needed. And we have a we've spent a lot of time and effort and money optimizing a system that can retrain very quickly on that, so that we can run this if we needed to hourly, but it doesn't usually change that fast. So we can update these topic models daily and reapply them and fit them without a problem. On the other side, when we're doing those and we're looking at things like how much they're talking about family and friendship, we actually use a different AI system entirely for that, to pull out those narratives at the individual and that medial group level. And that system is based on what they're now calling in AI a forward learning system. That's like a proprietary algorithm that I developed that actually does not need to be retrained. So we can deploy it in new crisis situations in over 200 languages immediately as soon as the crisis arises. So we don't need to wait, for example, for new data flows in a misinformation context in order to start gaining insight on the misinformation. We don't need something to go viral to create a classifier to see what that topic is, for example, either in a topic modeling space or in a more binary classification scheme. We can just deploy it immediately and already start getting the insights out of those conversations, because it learns the same way that we do when we're reading. It's just constantly incorporating new information and beliefs into a flexible or liquid learning neural network system.
Very cool. I'd be very interested in reading more about these methods if there's any documentation that you guys have, or
on some of them we do. On the other ones, we also have just like API documentation that explains like the outputs and what those look like and their structures.
Okay. Cool. I'll check those out.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much to both of you, Justin and to Patrick. I think they've been two fantastic and really nicely sort of complementary talks. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to hand back to Kitty O, who may just want to wrap up for us.
It's slightly confusing because there are two Kitties. One of the other Kitty I would like to thank very much. She's been fantastic in doing all the tech and all the organisation, and we really couldn't have run it without her. So a big thank you to Kitty Lowe. But it just leaves it for me to say thank you both so much to our speakers. They were absolutely wonderful talks. And please, if you're interested in any of these topics, go out and look at Patrick's research, check out Culture Pulse's website. There really are some fantastic resources. And I just want to say thank you both so much for giving us your time. Thank you.